on your back of countless I own. Could go on and on, the fool has never been told. I'm a living while I'm living, to the Father I will pray. Only him know how we get.
Out of the country for the past couple of weeks, and I'm very glad to be back. This evening we feature one of the monthly segments on social issues, and tonight we have a group of 5 persons, and we'll be discussing broadly the changing sexual and social mores in our country. People love to say that I reflect on my age, but I recall the days of Woodstock and Beatles, the days when free sex and free love seemed to have ruled the roost and changed the world for the better or worse. Drug abuse became quite normal, and the entire attitude, not only of young people, but others, society generally changed. More recently, we've had the Me Too movement, Harvey Weinstein, and that sexual predator who leads the so-called free world, Donald Trump, that have brought some amount of sanity back, whereby men in particular are not permitted, as they once felt free enough to do, to abuse their power, their position, and their money to exploit women and women folk. Of course, one might argue that that works both ways, but I think it is fair to say that as a general rule, the predator has been, with very few exceptions, men. On the program this evening, joining me is Nicole Thompson, who has organized the panel, and I will now ask her to introduce the panel. Nicole.
Thank you, Chris. Now, tonight we'll be talking on issues of consent, sexual grooming, sexual assault, and all that kind of comes under that. And we have with us Nicole Whaul, a forensic interviewer from ChildLink, Will Campbell, lecturer and psychologist, Loretta Knight, Women's Wednesdays advocate, and Juliana Lopes, representative of Aspire Youth Network. And we brought this panel together tonight because when it comes to issues of assault, particularly sexual assault when it relates to children, there seems to be a sort of mum on issues where persons don't actively want to have these conversations. And of course, this tends to kind of contradict the work that we're trying to do, because if you can't have conversations, particularly on issues of assault, then there's no way to raise awareness. There's no way that persons are able to accurately make decisions. So now, tonight we'll just have a bit of a discussion on some of the things that have been going on in Guyana, some of the issues that we felt are really burning at the time. So one of the first things before we kind of get in, I think is to kind of set the framework on consent. I feel like consent is an issue that not a lot of persons can accurately describe or speak on. No, I used to have issues with consent also. It wasn't something that I was able to define. No, I know when it comes to this, ChildLink has been doing a lot of work in the areas of child abuse, child sexual assault, and when it comes to consent, this is something that you've actively been working on trying to raise awareness on. You tell us a bit on what is consent in ChildLink's frame of reference?
Okay, first I'd like to say First, I'd like to say ChildLink is a child rights based approach organization, and we focus a lot on consent. And you're saying that most times people do not understand what is a consent, and I want to make this clear because I'm working in the department where we focus a lot on child sexual abuse, and I want the public to know that under 16 you cannot give consent. A child cannot give consent.
Let's be clear. When we talk about consent, we're talking consent to engage in sexual activity.
In sexual activities, that's
Yes.
right. Yes, sir. And so a child
Forget
under
the sir.
okay, a child under the age of 16 cannot give consent to partake in any form of sexual activity.
Yeah, and you see that's one of the things where in person's thing, because you might be 15 or 14, that you're emotionally or physically mature, particularly if it's a kind of older looking child, right? But the person is still a child, and so of course when it comes to issues of consent, that person has not reached full maturity. So of course that's where the issue comes. Now, in sort of framing the conversation on consent, now Juliana, I know Aspire Youth Network has been doing a lot of work in schools also. Was that a problem you have a lot, where you find children don't understand the concept of consent?
Well, the school sessions that I've done school sessions with one organization called GRP, which I think a lot of people know of. GRP stands for Guyana Responsible Parenthood Association. And then I did sessions with the organization that I'm now a part of, called Aspire Youth Network Guyana. And the sessions that we have done, we've noticed that a lot of young people, when they hear the word consent, they think it's something yes or no. And although consent is yes and no, there are different responses that you can give. And there are different actions also that implicate if you are given or not given consent. So what I usually do, depending on the age range of the students that I'm talking to, I usually try and give like a scenario whereby I tell them, imagine if you had food in front of you, and you tell your classmates that I am telling you that you can only have the rice in my food, and there's chicken and carrots and all of that. And the food is in my bag, and then I leave the class, and then I go and I check my food, and then the food's gone, right? So what happens there? And then when I give a situation like that, it allows children to see from an example, even though it's something as childish as food, it gives you an imagery of, okay, so this is wrong because I give consent to only eat the rice, when in actuality someone did the total opposite of what you told them to do. So when it comes to having consent to, I think a lot of people and organizations, they give really complicated terms. And when they give terms like this, they confuse a lot of children when you're having a conversation of consent, and it's especially targeted to children. You have to know how to relate to that knowledge to them. So I think that's also something that a lot of organizations should focus on, how to deliver sessions whereby if you're talking about consent, how to make it understandable and realistic.
Let me bring other people into this discussion. We talk about consent, as you said, Juliana, it's a yes or no. But should we be talking more broadly about the question of sexual education and the implications of what consent really does mean? It's not just say, yes, here's my body, I'm willing to share it. It must be more than that. Where does this fit in with this broader issue of sexual education, of should a person, because they reach 16, must feel that, okay, I can go and be liberal with my body?
I'm not sure how to respond to that, but in terms of sex education, and I'm referring to in the school curriculum, there's a lot of resistance. There's a lot of resistance by parents, for example, to the idea of teaching children about sex in schools. There are some parents who feel that this is in the domain of, this should be taught in the home. There are some people who think that children at that age are not ready.
But then consent is even worse, isn't it? To say that okay, then you have some opposition from the parents to sex education, but then you go on to talk about consent.
Well, I mean,
consent to the very thing that you're saying ought not to be taking place.
It is something that has to be done. it is something that needs to be done, because whether we want to admit it or not, our children are exposed to sexual activity, our children are exposed to sexual advances. It is something that has to be done. So it's a conversation that has to be had. But what I'm
When
saying
you
is
say
that
they're exposed to sexual activity, are you suggesting that 100% of children, 16, 17, are engaged in sexual activity?
no, not at all.
What are you suggesting?
I'm suggesting that quite a large percentage, not necessarily 100, but quite a significant percentage of children, 16, 17, 18, are in fact engaging in sexual activity. A lot of them out of ignorance, but at the end of the day, a lot of our children are in fact engaging in sexual activity. It is something that we need to address.
You raise an interesting point about this question of teaching sexual education. What's the panel's view? Should it be part of the school curriculum, say from the time a child reaches 10, 11, 12? And I ask that against the background. I have a niece who teaches very junior school. And in London, as you know, you've got so many different nationalities, so many different religions. And she was telling me the other evening that a parent said to her, look, I do not even want my child, and I think the child was a daughter, to know what are body parts. And this is the UK. So is the reluctance or resistance by Guyanese parents, as you said, it's taking place? Is it such an unusual thing? And is it a backward thinking position to take? Because it's better you know and know the implications than not know and suffer the consequences.
Yeah, definitely. Chris, let me jump in here. When it comes to sex education, particularly in Guyana, there are a lot of factors that hinder the progression of actually getting it into the schools and ensuring that it stays there, and also ensuring that the information is child accessible. That's one thing. When it comes to sex education, there's a lot of lashback from religious community, from parents. So those are all things that need to be considered. When it comes to the religious community, one of the arguments used is that, oh, if you teach sex education, then you're teaching children to have sex. That, of course, is not true.
Quite the opposite.
When you teach
Quite the
children
opposite.
about sex, then you're informing them better about themselves, about their bodies, and of course they're better able to make decisions at that point about their sexual health or lives. Now, if you take that decision away from them, then you're just basically selling misinformed children into the world. And children are having sex. That's a reality that we need to face. They are having sex. I remember GRPA, they did a survey, I think it was either last year or the year before, and they found that approximately like 70% of the children that they looked at were sexually active, and these were under 16. So it isn't a means of, oh, are the children having sex? What are we gonna do? Children are having sex, and we've been saying for a very long time now that one of the things that needs to be done is that they need holistic sex education, not the things that they currently do in schools. I mean, there have been adjustments. They have the HFLE program. That's they try, they do some stuff, but it's not enough. It's not enough.
Well, if 60, 70%, GRPA, that was a finding by a GRPA study.
Yes, they interviewed several young people in different regions in Guyana.
Was it a scientific kind of study, sample, or was it might have had some biases?
I won't be able to comment on that.
Okay, I thought it's important because we need, this is a program that tries to inform, not mislead. And
Yes.
we don't want people to believe, look, if a community has 10 children going to school, that 7 of them are sexually active. Now, if that is the case, why, and I hope you join in the conversation now, why is consent such an important issue? Because clearly you're probably saying that 70% are already engaged in the activity and are doing so voluntarily with consent.
Okay, I would really love to touch on something that you said earlier, and you asked about the backward thinking. Okay, so in Guyana, I believe there are 3 different generations.
I asked whether it was backward.
Yes, it is. I believe it is, because there are 3 generations of people. Some back in the days, they were everything is a kind of on the low hush. Today we have the internet, we have so many access to information outside of Guyana. I believe that it's time for us to actually take an introspective look at what's happening today, what the kids are knowing. Because in primary school, I probably would have known some of the things that 5, 6, 7-year-old would come and ask me. The generation is changing like really rapidly, so I believe that we need, as a society, we need to look at what's best for our kids instead of being like, I don't want to talk about my daughter. I don't want to talk about my daughter about the birds and the bees, and they're different.
What if a person resists or rejects it on religious grounds?
On religious ground, well, for me, I cannot challenge that.
No, but I'm asking you, what are your
religious.
thoughts on it?
I believe that.
Does that make it backward?
I do believe it makes it backward. I really believe that it is. Because
that's a bold statement to make, that because a person holds a religious conviction, it's backward.
But I believe somewhere in the Bible they talk about ignorance being no excuse. If I'm not too sure, but I believe
I don't think the Bible said that.
But there is ignorance. I'm not
the
sure.
Bible gets blamed for lots of things.
I think it does say that the people are
perishing
perishing for lack of knowledge.
Thank you very much.
That's probably what you're referring to.
So if that's there, then don't you think that you probably should change with the times instead of being just, this is the Bible, this is the Old Testament, New Testament?
I think a big part of the issue is a denial. There's fear, and there's denial, and there's misinformation. We, for example, think that if we talk to children about sex, then they'll just go and have sex like they're crazy. Which,
but 70% of them doing it anyway, according to this.
Exactly. And that's where the denial comes in. We don't want to admit to ourselves that our children are in fact engaging in sexual activity. We don't want to engage in that. We don't want to admit that. We don't want to accept that fact, and so we don't want to bring it up. And then there is, we're afraid to talk. A lot of people are uncomfortable with it.
Why do you think that is so? If we were as modern and the others are backward.
If who's modern?
I'm saying there is a generation gap in how we dealt with things back then. It's not the same way that we would deal with now. There is more information available now, and I think that probably as a society we should look at that and move forward. Absolutely. In order to benefit the kids, which are the future.
Right. They have that information available to them anyway. We buy phones and we give them, and we give them money so that they can.
You can control the phones, of course.
Well,
you can block sites.
How many of us do that? How many of us do
can.
that? We just hand the phones to our children. In fact, we don't even know how the phones operate.
Exactly. Yeah.
We don't even know how to operate the phones, but we give it to our children, and we're excited that they are brilliant enough to operate this complicated piece of machinery. And so we don't know what. And we don't inform ourselves, and we somehow feel that they will be protected from this thing that we're hiding from them.
And even if, children usually get information from other students in their class or the school. So if one child is misinformed, then they go and they basically tell other children, I hear this, and da. So that's how information is spread, like in a school setting. So things like that. That's why I think it's important to highlight it. Also, the HFLE program, it's not existent in all schools in Guyana, but it is existent in some. But at the same time, it's not comprehensive, meaning that it doesn't tackle issues like sexuality, which is very important for young people to understand and to know about their like gender identity and all these, which are very important to yourself. So things like comprehensive sexuality education. When people hear sexuality education, they think, we're teaching you to go and have sex, and that's not necessarily the case, because they talk about things like body image and body positivity and hygiene and all of that. So they look at your physical, your mental, your social self, your sexual self, all of these things that they look at in CSC at least.
And Chris, I want to bring out a point here where Child Protection Agency had a finding, and they said in 2016 there was a total of 1,478 boys who were actually exposed to various forms of sexual activities, and out of that there was 118 boys under the age of 16 who were sexually abused. In the form of the girls, it was 2,101 was exposed to sexual activities, and out of that 616 were sexually abused, giving us a total of 734 total. And I want to say this because it's important for us to teach our children about their body. It's important to teach them about not just consent and let them know that, okay, when you're at the age of 16, you're allowed to make your own decision to have sex. But it's more important of how to protect yourself and how to deal with somebody who's advancing you in terms of, okay, sexual grooming, which is a big thing in Guyana, because lots of children, whether teens or children under 16, are not aware that they're being sexually groomed, which is a form of abuse as well.
What exactly does sexual grooming mean?
Okay, so sexual grooming, Chris, is basically where an adult is actually grooming a child under the age of 16 or even a teenager, befriending that person, gaining the trust of that individual, and then gradually move that individual into partaking into sexual activity.
Let me ask you this. We talk about consent, and consent means cannot be a product of grooming, cannot be a product of undue influence, cannot be a product of superior bargaining position.
Mm-hmm.
Does the age of 16 or 18, which is adulthood, does that necessarily vest in the person, particularly who is a victim of grooming, who is a victim of that unequal relationship, that unequal balance? Is that consent really voluntary?
That is a very deep question. And I want.
The purpose is to answer the question, not to discuss the question.
I don't think that you can put an arbitrary age on maturity. There are people at 16, and I have my issues with that numbers, with that age, that law, the whole 16 thing. But I don't know of too many 16-year-olds, for example, who are really at a level of maturity that would allow them to make an informed decision about sexual involvement. Then again, let us suppose that people at 16, you emerge one day on your 16th birthday and, hey, I'm ready to make these decisions. If I had been groomed over the 2 years prior to that 16th birthday, I am now compromised. My capacity for making a decision about sexual activity has been compromised by the grooming. So I don't know if that points in a direction of an answer to that question, but that is how I would respond to that.
That's fair. That's good.
You see, one of the things about grooming people don't understand is that it can either be short term, in that it can be hours, days, weeks, months, or it can be long term. It can literally be years. Somebody can take like 5 years, 10 years between grooming a child. Now, that is something that needs to be considered, because when we talk about the sexual grooming, it's something that has become so very normalized. You go into almost any secondary school and you talk to the young children there, you'll hear stories about this student who's with some older person and it's just become accepted, wherein that person can even be in good relationship with that person's parents also. And that was something Renata and I were talking about earlier, wherein you have a child now, and then because that person might be in some situation, whether it might be economic poverty or something, they feel the need now to get their child to fill that sort of void, so they encourage that child, they groom their child for that sexual assault. Well, is it abuse? Sexual abuse, that is. You want to comment a bit more on the ways in which parents can also groom their children, because I feel like that's not a point.
But sexual grooming it doesn't involve parent. You mean
actually,
you mean
it
preparing
does.
children? You mean preparing rather than grooming?
The person can groom the parent. In
Yes,
terms
can
of
groom the parent.
Yes, they can groom the
but
parent.
It's not the parent grooming the child.
Well, I think there is responsibility on both ends.
No, that's not the point I'm getting at. The grooming, your definition of grooming is preparing the person, using the person, setting the person up for that day when you can come out fully and say, look, now is the time.
Okay.
Yeah, I believe that the parent can be responsible in that
Can
instance.
be responsible.
If they share part of the blame for the grooming, they can groom their child because of their economical position. They'd be like, okay, this person has a lot of money. He comes around. He's nice to us. He brings gift for the younger kids, stuff like that. That it's like, talk to him. Kind of like coercing their child into that can be a form of grooming.
So let me jump in here, because there's two forms of grooming. They can be face-to-face grooming, and which you have a contact grooming, and then they can be like what we call an online grooming, because our young people or children are exposed to.
But the objective is the same.
Yes, it is the same. And so you said the parents must take some responsibility, but I want to
Let me clarify.
Okay.
No, never finish, please. Never finish.
Because I want to jump on that for a bit, because in the term of, if the parent might not know that the groomer is actually trying to abuse that individual, so we have to be very careful when we say the parent might have to take some form of responsibility.
Never finish, please.
Right, so we need to be very careful in saying, that the parent is going to be responsible for that, because sometimes it's just. Let me give an example here as a forensic interviewer. I remember having dealing with a child, and the child was preparing for common entrance, and so this child was like 11 years old at the time. And what happened is that the child was the child's brother-in-law, I should say, who was a teacher. And so that individual was actually helping this child to prepare for exam in the sight of the parent. However, the parent thought that was fine because being a teacher, and the next thing you heard, that this child was actually abused by this individual sexually. The child started to act out and resist towards the individual, and so the individual went to the parent and said the child is not listening. The parent did not take note or any form of explanation from the child, as in why you're not listening, what's happening, and so on. So sometimes the parent saw it fit that, okay, being a teacher, you're preparing for common entrance, and so this individual is helping you. That's what was in the mind of the parent.
So that's what grooming is.
But this is a
Renata,
case.
you wanted to come in. No.
I wanted to clarify what I was saying. I'm not saying all parents are responsible, they take the blame. What I'm saying, there are some instances where the parent, the mom or the dad the moms would push the child towards someone who is in a better
They're actively
economic
involved in
kind of saying,
in
oh,
grooming the child for sexual abuse.
And
yes.
there are instances where the person, the groomer, grooms the parent to gain access to the child, like you would have just explained. That was just to clarify.
You wanted to say something else?
No, I was gonna ask. I mean, what of those cases where parents actively participate in the grooming process? Because my understanding of grooming is where you emotionally manipulate the child to make him or her more vulnerable to lower the child's inhibitions. Parents, there are some parents, and I'm glad that there are not more of them, but there are some parents who actually do that. And in that case, the parent is not just responsible, is guilty of grooming the child.
Is this part of the whole broader issue of education? Because we tend to think of education in the classroom, the child in school, but that parent probably has never heard the term sexual grooming. Actually, that word only gained some prominence. That term only gained some prominence. I think it was earlier this year or last year. The student and the teacher
Correct.
at the Bishop's High School.
Correct.
Lots of us didn't know about it.
Correct.
So, is it a broader problem of education in our society? It's also is it a question of economics? Lots of parents are single parents. They don't have the time. They're busy hustling a living for when that child comes back from school to get some food. So we should spare a thought for these parents who we want to blame and say we set the child into the tentacles of this Dracula.
I mean, yes, we do have, the world has poor people. Economics, of course.
Plenty.
Yes, economics, of course, will play a large role in many social ills. But when it comes to what you actually do, that is important. If you are a parent, then at no point should you set or try to set up your child to be sexually groomed because you might gain some sort of economic benefit from it. I mean, yes, from an economic standpoint, I can get while that might seem as a reasonable position, but think about the long-term effects of sexual grooming.
We are operating here on the assumption that people understand the long-term effects.
Absolutely. And they understand what grooming really is.
And they understand
grooming
what grooming is.
comes
Exactly.
out of trust. It can be extremely innocent.
Yeah.
You think, look, I am glad if a neighbor who is a teacher would come and spend half an hour with my child and help that child in maths or help that child in English or geography because I can't afford to pay lessons. But then you build trust, just like how you there are lots of con people out there. I don't want to say con men because it's not necessarily gender only. Lots of people out there. Those who engage in grooming have a certain cracked pattern to what they do. They're very convincing.
And that is one of the challenges. Sorry, that's one of the challenges with grooming, because sexual predators are usually very nice people. We think it is some, hairy guy lurking in the bushes. It is usually the nicest
Apparently nice people.
Right.
Yes.
And very often they're the nicest, apparently the nicest people, and so they're offering to help. They are sometimes playing a surrogate parent role. They're helping the parent sometimes economically or in other ways, and so everybody's guard is lowered, everybody's inhibitions are lowered, and that's what makes it so challenging. Another problem with it, I'm undone just now, is that it creates an atmosphere where we don't feel like we can trust anyone, and so genuine people who want to help are sometimes, we keep them at arm's length because we're not sure who is who.
One of the thing is, for predators, they pick on the vulnerability. They look at the person. It's not like they just come straight to you and be like, oh, I want to choose that child. They look at that child. They kind of see some of the vulnerable places that this child have it within their emotional state, physical state, and they kind of prey on that. So that is something that we probably should look at.
Yeah, definitely. When it comes to sexual grooming, one of the things you find, as you folks have mentioned already, is that it usually comes in conjunction with someone in a position of trust. So a family member, a teacher, a pastor, somebody who you look up to, who you can easily relate to, and that's what often happens. So they just kind of wear down that child's defenses, the parents' defenses, because they are seen as somebody who's trustworthy, who you can trust your child with, who you can send them to go play school or something like that. Now, the point you were making, Renetta, sorry, about I missed that point.
About they usually pick on the person's vulnerable
Yes,
points.
yes, vulnerability.
Yeah.
When we look at victims of sexual grooming, when you look at them, they're usually those with low self-esteem.
Yeah.
Those who might have problems at home. Those who might, Chris brought up the point about poverty earlier, those who might be poverty stricken, because a lot of times people use that to get in.
Yeah.
Oh, I'll give you a bit of money if you might do this for me. And so all of these things are factors of sexual grooming.
We get, and I want to get back to these statistics and this education. Now, it must not be felt. And again, I base my comment on my niece's experience, who is in fact a fairly junior teacher as well. It's I think she said 15 minutes. So it's not that it is preoccupation. Similarly, some of the statistics we're coming out with, and I'm not challenging anybody, I'm just challenging the numbers, might even suggest that somehow there is this preoccupation. That's all children at school or children on a telephone are doing. I mean, if that were the case, and I say were rather than was, because I don't think it is. If that were the case, we wouldn't have any child that is educated other than in sexual matters, would we?
Chris, I disagree with that.
Why?
I disagree with that. When it comes to numbers, children, when it comes to sexual abuse, it's not something that's openly discussed. So of course, this is not an
No,
area
we're not
that you
talking
actively-
abuse. The figures I was questioning
Yeah, I know you're talking about the figures.
was the figures of 70% children being
Involvement.
actively engaged in sexual activity. That's what I'm talking about.
Okay, so you're challenging those figures?
I believe it may very well be on the high side.
Sexual activity does not necessarily mean
Broad
they're in.
spectrum.
Yes, it's a very broad spectrum.
Yes, well, define what sexual activity means then.
So, Chris, I want to
No, let her, please.
Okay, if you say sexual activity does not mean straight to penetration. There are different activities that you can do. They can be touching. They can, there can be masturbation. There are different aspects of sexual activity. So when they're saying sexual activity, they don't mean all 70% of these persons are actively having sex.
No, but you're saying that 70% are actively engaged in some activity that revolves around sex.
Yes.
Whether it's penetrative sex,
Yeah.
Viewing
whether it's
pornography.
oral sex, whether it's pornography.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm trying to understand, Chris, because you're trying to say that the 70% you believe that it's higher.
No, I wasn't saying it was high.
Okay.
I'm saying it may be on the high side.
It may be on the high
I think he's
side.
saying that it may be biased, basically.
He thinks that the figure is too high.
Maybe too high.
Okay.
I mean,
Maybe.
Unless you've done a proper scientific random sampling that gets a good pick of your population, meaning of those children, then you can get biases. If you
You concentrate.
we as a society, we love to identify and comment on the extremes rather than the norm. The child who studies and puts their head in the book and have flirtatious engagements might not attract our attention, but yes, 70% engage in sexual activity. Let's count. We have 7 here. Good. We have 10 here. 7 of you. So I think it's important that we get those numbers right, and also the kind of organizations that do those studies, because they themselves, organizations have biases as well. So do individuals. But since we were talking about consent, what exactly is consent in the particular context of these young people?
Okay. I feel like everyone.
Listen, is your name the topic, you know?
No, yes, let's cover consent, but there's some points that you made that were really burning. I feel like we also need to address. But when it comes to consent, what is it? Now, consent, when it relates to sexual activity, it means it's a decision you make about whether you want to be engaged in sexual activity or not.
In
Now-
in a broader context, as we were discussing, it's not short. It could even be short of penetrative sex.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So, Juliana made a point earlier about persons usually looking at consent as a yes or no spectrum. Now, for sake of clarity, I know a lot of people use that explanation because it's short, it's quick, it's snappy, it's easy to understand. Yes means yes, no means no. But of course, that doesn't really account for the kind of blurred areas, because a lot of people don't talk about things like sexual coercion, which is also very important, and it's not a conversation that's usually had.
So a
As
coerced yes,
Yes.
unfair
is not
imbalance in the
consent then.
relationship. Is that genuine consent?
Right.
It's
not.
not.
It's
It's
not.
not.
It's
It's
not.
No, it's not. And of course, people when they talk about sexual coercion, they see it as they didn't see it as a problem, because of course, if you say yes, then they think you're agreeing to a sexual activity. But of course, that was an answer that was coerced out of you.
But if I take you to the middle of the back dam and I say, well, I'm leaving you here unless you say yes, that
Yes.
yes is not
That's
consent.
consent.
Right.
Yes.
That
Yes.
is not consent.
Yeah.
But we're talking about under 16. What then constitutes consent? Here you have two people, both of them considered by the law not competent to make that decision. How should the law view the aggressor, and how should the law view the victim, given that both of them, and it might be the case that the victim is actually older than the aggressor?
I'm not sure what that has to do with anything.
Well, it's consent. It has to do with consent.
You're saying both persons are under
Under
the age
16,
of
yes.
16.
Yes.
Yeah.
I don't think
What is your understanding of consent in those circumstances?
I don't know how to answer that question. I don't think that, like you correctly said, that children under the age of 16 are capable of giving consent. And I think that the law in some jurisdictions, and I'm not quite sure what obtains here, gives consideration to the fact that someone might be, in the case where two persons engage in sex and both are underage,
Yes.
it is not considered criminal. There are jurisdictions where it is not considered criminal, so no one would be prosecuted in a situation like that. If, however, one of those persons were an adult, then there's a problem.
Do you see a problem with that?
Under
Under 16s?
under 16-year-olds having sex. Yes, there is a problem with it. Yes, but when it comes to issues of consent, you cannot penalize a 16-year-old for having sex with, under 16-year-old having sex with another person who's under 16. It's frowned upon when we talk. That's why when we talk about sexual education, it's very important that it's being brought into school so that children can become better informed about their sexual rights. So they'll know that, okay, maybe now might not be the best time for me to have sex. Maybe I need to wait more. And of course, when we think about responsible sexual health. When we think about responsible sexual health, that is something that needs to be talked about. Because of course, as Will mentioned, you can't necessarily penalize somebody under the law for having sex with someone who's the same age or in the same age range as them. but it is something that shouldn't happen. But of course, that is where education comes in, and that's why it's important that we have sex education in school, comprehensive sex education, and not the things that are usually being filtered. No, because we have a lot of uninformed children or misinformed children.
Anybody is a school teacher? No.
I know.
Because the question, the purpose of that question is, what does the school curriculum cover in terms of sexual education?
Not much.
I think it would depend on the school. I've done sessions in several schools, and some of them have an HFLE.
As what? You're not a teacher?
No, I'm not a teacher. I'm a facilitator. So when we go to the school sessions, we usually go through the HFLE curriculum, and they usually have an hour for a HFLE coordinator, which is usually the social worker under the Ministry of Education, who goes and delivers a HFLE awareness session.
Which is what?
Health and family life education. That's something that's in different Caribbean countries also. But the one at Guyana has, although they've been incorporating different elements that are in the comprehensive sexuality education, they don't necessarily, as I said earlier, they don't look at sexuality or gender or LGBT rights and all these other things that are very pertinent among youth. They don't look at that. So with the HFLE curriculum, it's only 1 hour, and it's not... it really depends on who's delivering the session, and I say that because everyone has their own agenda, and we've been talking about agendas a lot tonight. And as a social worker in the Ministry of Education, that person may have a different agenda than someone from a non-governmental organization. And it goes back to say that, are these people following like a certain guideline, or is it the case whereby I'm speaking my personal beliefs and I'm trying to educate children, but at the same time I'm trying to say, okay, I don't think you should do this because I don't think you should do this. Not because it's not healthy for your body, but because for me, I don't think you as a child should be doing this.
Any comment on that?
Yeah, so I would like to say, Chris, that education on sex should not begin in the schools, but it should begin at home. It should begin years ago growing up. I remember the saying, it takes a community or a village to raise a child. It should be taught in your community, in your youth group, despite of whichever religious organization or background you're from. It should be taught in there, because I am aware of the HFLE, and like you said, it's not in depth. And we have a thing in Guyana where we say to a child, don't do this. And when the child say, why? You just say, because I'm the adult and I say to you, don't do that. So if we say to children that you should not be having sex because you're under the age of 16, and that's what the law say, and the child said, but why shouldn't I? You know, you say, because the law say that. We're not teaching the children, or saying because it can affect your body, because they're STDs, they're STIs, your organs are not fully developed. These are the complications that will happen. But we tell children not to. And when you say to a child not to, and you don't explain properly, obviously children are going to go and they're going to experiment. They're informed with gadgets. Of recent, I recall my 4-year-old niece went onto my phone, went onto YouTube, and she was watching a cartoon. And when she was finished, I took back the phone, and you know they have the history of what you were watching. So I went back into the phone, and lo and behold, I found that she was watching a cartoon that had sexual contact inside, and I was blown away, because I was unaware that they have a cartoon with images of sexual contact. And so we need to be properly, you know, educated. Parents need to be properly educated. Not
Whose obligation is it to educate parents?
Themselves.
It's truly a national obligation.
Parents should obligate. Parents should educate
Yeah, but
themselves.
don't you think if they knew, and if they had the time and if they had the resources, they would do it?
Some parents have the time and the resources, and they're not interested. They're not interested.
And if they're not interested, what do you do?
That's where the school comes in. That's where the school and the religious organizations and other organizations,
You see,
that's where they come in. They
this-
fill that gap.
This shows the deficiencies in our national policies. In, for example, what do you do with that child of a parent who says, I do not want my child to participate? We have to confront the issue. Do they have a right to do so? I think strictly the answer is yes. We may not like it, we may not think it's good, but the answer is still yes.
Right. 'Cause
So how do you resolve that? Who then takes responsibility? And there's so many big issues confronting our society, and the failing is often education, but you have no central direction. As you said, Julia, it varies from school to school. It ought not to, because then you have that individual biases, and you could have grooming taking place right in that classroom. And that makes it extremely dangerous. Should you have one teacher, for example, only in that classroom? What if you... Thank goodness we have most of our schools, I think, are co-educational. I don't think we have any non-co-educational. But how you deal with that situation? Who does it?
As she rightfully said just now, it takes a community to raise a child. I believe that there should be education, there should be community outreaches for all ages, not just, you're targeting the kids in school. You can also try to educate the parents. You can do house-to-house visits. I believe that they can have organizations go out and meet the parents where they are.
But I like the fact that, Chris, you were asking who is responsible if the parents are not educated or they're not aware of what is happening. The nation is responsible for the parents to be aware. The nation is responsible for our children. Child protection lets us know clearly that the children belongs to the state and they have a right if a child is being sexually abused or sexually...
The child belongs to the state.
So hold on,
That's a
hold on.
That's
hold
a
on,
serious...
hold on.
That sounds like the strictest form of communism to me. Careful,
Let me clear
careful.
that up. So, because if child protection is aware, what I'm trying to say, if child protection is aware that this child is being sexually abused and it's not reported by the people that they're living with, and the perpetrator is in the home, child protection have the right to go to investigate. They don't believe in taking the child away from the family, but the perpetrator needs to be removed from the home. If not, the child will be removed and given to another family member who will take care of the child. So it's the state's responsibility to educate the family,
Educate and to protect, not-
and to
but not-
protect.
Yes,
not
but
only.
it should
Yes.
not have reached
Yes.
so far.
Yeah.
I don't think it should reach that far. So that's why we as a community have to educate all ages. It should not be until the child would have been abused, then you take action as the nation or as the state. I believe that we can do more now before it reaches that state.
We talk about consent with kids. What about consent among adults? And I think we just got a few minutes left. What about consent among adults? You have to have consent even in marriage.
Yes.
yes,
A husband has no right to his wife's body,
I don't.
or vice versa.
I get.
So in that, because
I get.
the legal position is a man can rape his wife, and vice versa.
Yes, and when I raise this among men, because I do a lot of work, in male populations, when I raise this among men, I get a lot of blowback from it, because men, can't understand if this is my wife. How is it that I could rape my wife? And I think maybe somebody could explain that for us.
I think it goes with entitlement and the fact that as a husband you have the power and control over your wife, and even vice versa in a relationship.
You don't.
No, but that's how a lot of men who have this ideology, they see things like this. They
But
see
society teaches us that.
Yeah, because you have this ring that you belong to me,
belong,
right?
Uh-huh.
and you romanticize this idea of belonging to someone to the point where you give your heart, your body, your soul, everything to this one person, that if you reject them, then what about the vows that we made? And it goes to a lot of people who are misinformed, and they would think that, as I said, because you are married to this person, that you're obligated to do this and that, and whatever you want to do to this person because you are married. And in cases of consent, and we do look at consent a lot with children and teenagers, but we don't look at it in cases of adults. And for me, at least, I always speak on the importance of knowing and recognizing power and control in situations whereby the perpetrator has this position that they have attained, either rightfully or wrongfully, whatever the case may be, but they feel that because I am this director or this big fancy person with a lot of money and this social status, that I can do whatever I want to do to this person. And victims of sexual assault or sexual abuse, rape, they do not have that power to fight back, whether it's physically, emotionally, financially. And it also looks at the fact that when it comes to rape and sexual assault with adults too, I think adults may be more afraid to come forward than children. And I know that's a very broad statement and it's not something that I should say, but I think when you look at cases where adults, they have been abused, they don't necessarily want to state this has happened to them because it looks like a form of weakness, and we see vulnerability as weakness. We as a society, we see opening up and expressing your feelings and your emotions makes you a weaker person and a weaker being. So when it's cases of abuse with adults, I think coming forward, I think it's a bit more difficult, and that's just me, what cases that I have seen in my work at least. So, and even with children, I think that a lot of programs are so central around children that even if they do not say the words, I have been abused, they would be able to show it. And they know that because mommy and daddy tell me, oh, if somebody touch you there, and do this, do that. So there's not that education with adults. And I don't think that even children who have been abused, I don't think it's the case whereby you give that child counseling. I don't really see that as something that happens a lot in situations where it's continuous counseling so that they can actually recover from whatever has happened to them.
All right, let me get back to this question about consent among adults and in a marriage. Do you think that is well understood in Ghana?
Absolutely.
No.
No.
And so, in other words, you think that the prevailing or conventional wisdom is that you can't rape, you have an automatic right to your spouse,
Yes.
and the question of rape doesn't arise.
Exactly. That is the prevailing wisdom. That is the and men are adamant about this. I mean, this is my wife. How you could tell me that I raped me wife? How is it possible for a man to rape his wife? It is not understood that even within the context of a marriage relationship, that a man must have consent.
Well, just interjecting a little bit of law, that's the legal position.
Right.
That was not that wasn't determined socially.
Right.
That was determined by way of
By
law.
law.
And so that is the prevailing situation. That's the current position. And that in fact took place long before we had this greater awareness, this greater rights, women rights as equal partners in a marriage.
But we're not even. I mean, even women are not aware of this. Not even women are aware of this. I'm a.
Well, what about the women on this panel? Why aren't they helping to share that information?
And I think, I did sessions with adults.
That's the question I asked. I posed a question.
Yeah, and for me at least, when we brought up marital rape, women would say, oh, but it's my husband.
Exactly.
And I think that even though it's something
Well,
legal.
well, if it's her husband, she's that's giving consent.
Yes.
That's
yeah, but
implied
then, but
consent.
then she would say, oh, I don't want it, but at the same time, it's my husband, and he going out to work, he bringing in all the money, so I have to do this, and so even though it's something, marital rape, as we see it, it's something legal. In terms of the social context,
Culture.
we see marriage as you said, as like a contract.
I'm sorry, I have to bring this discussion to an end. The operator is signaling. So I want to thank you, Paula, for organizing this team. Juliana Lopes, Renata Knights, Will Campbell, and Nicole Whaul. Thank you so much for this discussion. I don't want this program, particularly our monthly session on the social issues, to just appear to be all about sex and sexual issues. And I'm hoping that on the next occasion we can discuss perhaps the most topical and critical economic / social issue, the question of oil and how young people see the discovery and the exploitation of oil in our country as serving them and future generations. So I want to thank you very much, and operators and viewers, thank you. Have a good night.